I humiliated him by calling my ex during family dinners. Now he pretends I don't exist. Looking back, I can see how I ruined everything, but it wasn't a single reckless moment. It was a slow string of mistakes that eventually led me to messing up everything that I had. When I first met my husband, Lenny, it was one of those ordinary moments you don't expect to matter. We were both at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, just a long table at a restaurant with small talk going around. He ended up next to me halfway through, and before I knew it, we had spent an hour laughing about something no one else even thought was funny. Conversation flowed so easily between us, and we were both surprised we hadn't met sooner. From that night, we kept running into each other at different gatherings until we were exchanging numbers and meeting up on our own. Dating him was great. I'd been in relationships before that burned bright, but were ultimately unstable. But with Lenny, it wasn't like that. There was passion, but it was also calm. He was thoughtful and easy to be with. Those early days were full of dinners, concerts, and long walks. Even hard moments felt simple with him. Sometimes we'd stay up all night talking about our childhoods or our futures. Meeting his family felt natural because he'd already told me so much about them, and they welcomed me instantly. It was the same when he met mine. Soon, both sides were asking when we'd get serious and settle down. We didn't rush, though. We took the time to really get to know each other. And after 3 years, he proposed on a short trip we had always wanted to take. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect, and I said yes without hesitation. Our first years of marriage were comfortable. We moved from a small apartment to a house with help from our parents, and since we already knew each other's routines, life together felt easy. We figured out chores, bills, and cooking without much trouble. Arguments happened, but never felt serious. Each time we worked through one, I felt more sure I'd chosen the right man, the kind you could build a life with. We built small traditions as time passed, like specific meals on certain nights, grocery trips on the same day each week, or afternoons at the park every other weekend. Nothing intense, but they mattered. And what truly became the center of our lives were the family dinners. At first, they happened on holidays or birthdays, but soon they became their own tradition every other week. One family would host, sometimes us, and everyone brought food until the table was overflowing. The nights were loud and full of stories. There were always kids running around and aunties busy in the kitchen. It could be overwhelming, but I loved it. I loved seeing Lenny so relaxed and lighting up in that space. It made me feel like we weren't just building a marriage, but we were part of something bigger than us. The dinners became routine, an unspoken agreement that everyone would show up. They gave me comfort and this sense of security. It made me feel like we would never drift apart. Even when life outside felt stressful, there was always that space to return to. And maybe I got too caught up in that comfort, because I didn't pay attention to what was happening in my marriage soon enough. It was easy to pretend everything was fine in a room full of family, but the cracks were there just waiting for me to notice. Because somewhere along the way, our marriage began to change. It wasn't a dramatic fight or a betrayal that started it. It was all these little things that were ignorable at first. A missed kiss goodbye in the morning, and shorter conversations. And at night, we would sleep on opposite sides of the bed, something we'd never done before. He was still kind and everything, but it was as though some part of us had gone quiet. I noticed it most in the moments between those family dinners. At the dinners themselves, nothing seemed wrong. Surrounded by all that noise and comfort, we still looked like the couple we had always been. We smiled and held hands and played our part in the routine. But at home, away from everything, the space between us seemed so intense. So did the quiet. He didn't seem to feel it. He carried on as though nothing was different, but I couldn't ignore this feeling like maybe the spark had faded. At the start of it, of course, I didn't know how far it would go or what it would eventually push me to do. I just know that I felt restless and unsatisfied, and I was really hesitant to bring it up because there was a part of me that was unable to admit even to myself that the marriage I had once loved so much was starting to slip into this weird state. So at first, I told myself that what we had was simply evolving and changing. People always said marriage wasn't meant to stay in the honeymoon phase forever, and that it eventually shifted into something more comfortable and sustainable. I thought maybe that was all it was, that we were just settling into a quieter space, and that as long as we still loved each other and kept showing up, then maybe that was enough and we would be fine. But it got harder to keep that perspective as the weeks turned into months. He wasn't unkind, but he was distracted in a way he hadn't been before. He would come home from work drained, and his attention was constantly on anything but me. The little actions that once made me feel so loved happened less and less until I realized I couldn't remember the last time they'd happened at all. I couldn't understand it, and I naturally started blaming myself. I thought maybe it was me, that maybe I was the one who had stopped trying and had stopped giving him reasons to pay attention. That mindset was the start of me buying new clothes and trying to cook his favorite meals more, initiating more sex and trying to get us to go out more. Weeks of that, but still, nothing seemed to stick. He was grateful for a lot of it. He smiled and he thanked me, but it just kind of seemed obligatory and the distance just kept growing. There were moments I convinced myself it had to be another woman. What else could explain the way he had pulled away? I went so far as to check for signs like changes in his routine, unexplained absences, or really anything at all, but there was nothing. His time was split between work and family, the same as always. If anything, his commitment to everyone else only seemed stronger than mine, which left me feeling even worse. Knowing he wasn't cheating should have been a relief, but in some ways it stung more. He wasn't pulling away because he'd found someone else exciting. It seemed like he was just tired. Of me, maybe of the marriage itself. He just always seemed so preoccupied and uninterested, and that, I realized, was harder to compete with because it wasn't about anyone else. It was just about me. It was about his lack of desire for me. I stayed optimistic and delusional, though. I told myself it was fine and that this was just a rough patch. I chose to believe everyone when they said that marriages weren't meant to be fireworks all the time. I clung to the idea that if I stayed patient and let things breathe for a bit, we would find our way back to each other. And in the meantime, I just needed something else to think about, some kind of distraction. I couldn't have known that what I was wishing for would turn out to be the very thing that ruined everything. The distraction came one afternoon when I least expected it. I was out running errands, moving through the dull rhythm of the day, when I spotted him. My high school boyfriend, Richie. The first boy I ever really loved, and the one who had been more than just a partner. He had been my best friend for years before things ever got romantic, and he was the one person who knew me in ways no one else did. Seeing him standing there, older but still so unmistakably him, was incredible. We ended up spending the afternoon catching up, and the time just slipped by without me noticing, because it all felt so natural it was like no time had passed at all. He told me about his years in London. After high school graduation, he had moved to London to stay with his mother and for college. It was what had caused us to break up back then. And then, after college, he decided that he didn't want to come back, which had broken my heart at the time, but I understood that he had fallen in love with the city and wanted to feel more connected to his mother. I told him about my life, my job, and my marriage, very basic stuff. We didn't really talk a lot about me. I really just wanted to know what he'd been up to all that time. It had been years since the last time we'd talked, and even longer since the last time we'd seen each other. But even at that, we kind of fell into step so easily. We laughed over old memories and stories of school, all the silly things we used to think were the biggest problems in the world. When I finally looked at my phone, I realized I had completely lost track of time, and that I'd been so happy to see him, I hadn't asked what he was doing back in America in the first place. That was when he revealed that his father had had some health scare, so he flew in to see him. But now that he was all right, he was flying back. He told me that he would have tried to contact me, but he wasn't sure I would even want to hear from him, which I told him was ridiculous. Of course I wanted to see him. Then Richie told me that his flight back to London was that night and asked for my number so we could stay in touch if I wanted. And even though we had a past together, it all felt innocent enough. It was really just two old friends reconnecting. So I agreed without hesitation. And from that point on, Richie became my distraction. It started with texting each other almost every day, then it progressed to these long phone calls. I'd have to take most of them at odd hours because of the time difference, but I never minded. It was shockingly easy to fall back into rhythm with him, because he still knew how to make me laugh and make me feel so much better. I hadn't seen the man since I was 18, and yet I was staying up late in the kitchen just to wait for his calls. I forgot how light it felt to talk to him. With him, I didn't feel invisible anymore. Richie gave me his full attention, and I hated just how much I liked it. I didn't tell my husband. I knew how jealous he could get and how much he hated the idea of me being close with other men, let alone one who had been such an important part of my past. I justified the secrecy by telling myself that it was harmless and that I wasn't doing anything wrong. Richie and I were just catching up and keeping each other company, and that it would only cause more problems if I told Lenny. It was just temporary, something to help me through a strange time in my marriage. That was all I thought it was. All I told myself it was. It felt fine, even good, to compartmentalize it that way. While I waited for my husband and I to find our way back to normal, Richie filled the gaps. He gave me something to look forward to and something to smile about. I told myself I could balance it, and I was so sure that nothing bad could come of it. What I didn't realize was how easily I was setting myself up for something I wouldn't be able to undo or fix. I still remember the night it all began, though at the time it didn't feel like a beginning at all. It felt like nothing more than a happy accident. We were at one of the family dinners when Richie's name lit up my phone. I hadn't heard from him all day, and I was so excited that I picked it up without hesitation. I didn't even think to excuse myself from the table or step away to take the call in private. I was too eager and caught up in the thrill of hearing from him. I told everyone it was Richie, and my parents and siblings practically lit up. He was such a big part of my life growing up that I'm sure they couldn't even try to forget him. He was at our house almost every day back then. They were all so happy to hear from him, and before I knew it, I had him on speaker. I explained how we had reconnected after so many years, and he said hello and chatted with everyone around. The conversation with him quickly took over the dinner. What had begun as small talk spiraled into laughter and shared stories. It was almost as though Richie was sitting right there with us, instead of miles away. It practically felt like he was the guest of honor. My husband smiled at first. He was polite and reserved, but I could tell that he wasn't excited. Then his presence kind of faded as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2. My focus was on Richie's voice and everything he was saying. I almost completely forgot about Lenny in that moment. By the time the call ended, all anyone could talk about was how wonderful it was to hear from him again. Even Lenny's family, who I had just introduced to Richie, were going on about what a great guy he seemed like. It was only when we got home that night that I remembered that something was off with Lenny. He was upset about the call and the fact that I hadn't told him about running into Richie, but he didn't exactly say anything. He was just sulking around the house and slamming things harder than usual. And honestly, I was exhausted by it. It had been weeks of his strangeness, and his never actually talking about whatever was wrong. I was tired of it. So that night I gave myself a break and I didn't even ask. I went to bed like I didn't notice anything, and that was that. That first call should have remained a one-off, but instead it grew roots. The next dinner rolled around, and without really planning it, I found myself dialing Richie again. This time it was a video call, and it was my mother who actually suggested it, saying how nice it would be to check in. The expectation in the room made it feel natural, so once again his voice filled the table. I passed the phone around so they could all look at him, and he could say hi and talk to them face to face. And from there, things just got out of hand. It became its own thing. I was calling him at almost every dinner. My parents looked forward to them, and they would often ask, before I'd even pulled out my phone, whether Richie would be joining us virtually. They would tease him about his life in London with terrible accents, and then tease him about still not having a girlfriend after all that time. Each time, the conversation stretched longer and longer, and they mostly revolved around him. Everyone wanted to hear about what he'd been up to, and he slowly became a part of those dinners until it felt almost incomplete without him. And slowly my husband began to fade into the background. At first it was small. He would sit quietly, his eyes on his plate while the rest of us laughed at Richie's stories. I told myself it wasn't deliberate and that he was simply tired or preoccupied, and that there was no real reason for him to be upset. It's not like Richie was actually at the dinners. I went out of my way to ignore his bad mood, but as the weeks went on, it became impossible not to notice. He was the only one at the table who seemed left out and who didn't say a word during the calls. There were nights when Richie's call practically dominated the entire evening. I would look around the table and see how happy everyone was, but then there was Lenny barely cracking a smile. He would excuse himself early and mutter something about needing air, while I stayed behind and continued to talk to Richie. I told myself there was no danger in it and no reason for guilt. But I see now that it wasn't really about secrecy in those weeks. It was about replacement. Slowly but surely, Richie was taking up space in the family and Lenny was kind of being iced out. And I was the one who caused it. It was my fault. Weeks passed like this, with dinners blending into each other with Richie as the centerpiece. Everyone was interested in him, and each comment and laugh kind of reinforced this idea that this was normal, even good. And so I leaned into it, and I rarely ever stopped to think about what it must have felt like for the man sitting beside me, watching himself become unimportant in his own family. But Lenny could only take it for so long. Eventually, things had to come to a head, and it happened a few weeks ago. The dinner had gone as usual, Richie's call lasting well over an hour, and everyone was hanging on his every word. He had truly just charmed everyone. He was that kind of guy. My husband, though, barely spoke the entire evening, and honestly, I'm not sure I would have noticed if he did. It wasn't until we were home that he finally broke. He confronted me about the whole thing and told me that he felt humiliated, that every time I called Richie, it was as though I erased him from the table. He said I was replacing him and had made space for another man in our marriage and in the family. I told him he was being dramatic and that Richie wasn't even in the country. I insisted that they were just harmless phone calls and that they were more for my parents than me anyway. I told myself and him that he was overreacting and letting jealousy cloud his judgment and make him read too much into what was nothing more than friendly banter. But he didn't see it that way. He continued to accuse me, and I deflected over and over again. I dismissed everything that he was saying because at that time, there truly was nothing going on with me and Richie. By the time the fight ended, we were further apart than we had ever been. Neither of us apologized, and we didn't fully hash it out like usual. We just went to bed angry with each other. After that night, things grew more strained and cold between us. And though I told myself he was being ridiculous, deep down I knew the truth. Richie hadn't been there physically, but he had taken up residence in my head, and I let it happen. I allowed him to become more important to me than I was willing to admit at the time. It was easy to pretend like there was nothing there, because Richie himself wasn't there, but eventually that changed. When Richie told me he was coming back, I wasn't sure how to feel. We had built this undefined thing between us that had become second nature after a while, but there was always the safety of distance. He was in London while I was here, and that gap protected me from having to face the truth of what was happening. But when he said he'd be around for a few weeks and asked if we could meet up again, I knew I should have said no, but I didn't. At first, I hesitated. The fight I'd had with Lenny was still fresh in my head. I knew that seeing him would only blur the lines further. I knew it was dangerous. But then I started making excuses and telling myself that things between us were just friendly and that they would stay that way. I deluded myself into thinking that could ever be true, and I said yes. I went to see him, and I didn't tell Lenny a thing about it. The first meeting was harmless, at least on the surface. We chose a cafe in town, and seeing him again in person was so overwhelming. Now that we had the time, I got to really look at him. It was so strange to see the boy that I'd fallen in love with slightly graying hair and a beard. He was still so handsome, though. I couldn't help but focus on that, on his body too, how muscular he had gotten. We talked for hours, and it left me feeling lighter than I had in months. On the way home, I told myself I had been right, and it wasn't serious. It was just two old friends seeing each other again, nothing more. But then it happened again. Another text and another suggestion to meet, which I agreed to, this time for lunch during my break. And then there was another and another. Before I knew it, we had slipped into a new routine of seeing each other pretty regularly under the guise of casual reunions. And with each meeting, things between us started to shift. It got harder to deny what we were both feeling. I began to look forward to our encounters with a kind of desperation I hadn't felt in years. It felt like it was all I had at the time. I thought about what I would wear, how my hair looked. I was so bothered about everything. I couldn't admit to myself back then that I wanted him to find me attractive still, the same way I found him attractive. The flirtation began subtly, some compliments and looks that went on for way too long. There were all these lingering touches that I didn't stop. Each touch made me feel so much. I told myself it was harmless, just the natural closeness of two people who had always been comfortable with each other. But deep down, I knew better. One afternoon, he mentioned how much he had missed this and us together. And there was just this way that he said it that made me feel like we were the only ones in the world. It was too much in the moment, so I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me in a way I knew could only lead to trouble. And eventually it did. Because there came a night that changed everything. We had planned to meet for dinner, nothing unusual. Some quiet restaurant tucked away from the busier parts of the city. From the moment we sat down, there was this intensity between us. The conversation was easy, as always, but beneath that, there was a current that neither of us could ignore. By the time the plates were cleared, I knew I wasn't ready for the night to end. So when he suggested we go back to his hotel for a nightcap, I decided to go. I knew it probably wasn't smart to say yes, but I was still trying to rationalize it and make it seem innocent in my head. But the moment we stepped into his room, it was like something in the air changed. We drank wine and sat close. Our bodies were touching in all these different places. The closer we got, the more I told myself that I should leave, and yet I couldn't bring myself to move. The truth was that I didn't want to. When he reached for me, it felt inevitable. His hand cupped my cheek, and I leaned into it before I even realized what I was doing. The first kiss was very hesitant, like we were both scared because we knew the gravity of what we were doing. But then years of feelings bubbled to the surface and things got heated. Clothes fell away, and his hands grabbed my body in a way that felt familiar, but also new. He was more sure this time, more mature. There was no awkward fumbling, just passion and recklessness. It was messy and overwhelming, and still it felt like the most natural thing in the world with him. When it was over and he fell asleep, my thoughts started to get away from me. I started to panic a bit because I knew I'd completely betrayed Lenny. There was no more illusion to cling to. I had crossed a line. I was spiraling right there in Richie's hotel room. But then Richie turned to me in his sleep, and I don't know. Just looking at him in that moment, all the guilt faded away. All I felt was the warmth of his body and the rush of being wanted. It was intoxicating, so much so that I pushed Lenny from my mind. And after that, I told myself it was a one-time thing, a slip and a mistake that I could bury. But deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. The affair consumed me in a way I hadn't expected. What started with one intense night became a pattern, something that felt way too easy to slip into. Richie and I kept meeting, and it was always under the cover of ordinary excuses. Lenny stayed oblivious through it all. I would leave the house without telling him exactly where I was going like I always did. Then I would go meet up with Richie. We always ended up back at his hotel room. Each time it was different, but always better than the last. He knew me and my body. We felt connected in a way I hadn't felt with my husband in ages. The sex was everything my marriage lacked. It was passionate and addictive. It made me feel alive. I told myself that it was just physical, just filling a void until I could figure things out, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The more we met, the deeper I sank into whatever it was that I was feeling for Richie. It felt way too complicated to put into words. When we were together, it felt like everything else just didn't matter. Everything became insignificant when Richie was touching me. I wanted to be with him and around him all the time. So much so that I almost invited him to one of the family dinners when he was in town. But thankfully, I didn't. At home, life carried on as if nothing had changed. Things between Lenny and I stayed distant and weird. At that point, I wasn't even trying to fix it. I didn't really care. All I wanted was to be with Richie. It felt like he had consumed every part of my life, and the lying that I had to do to maintain what I had with him became second nature. It's so pathetic to think now just how willing I was to risk everything for him back then. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. Richie was only in the country for a few weeks, and eventually they ran out. He had to head back to London. We had sex the night before his flight, and in a moment of weakness, I begged him not to go. I told him that we could try to make things work. Now, I know that I got caught up in past emotions and feelings and great sex. But then I was in a state. I begged him to stay. He looked at me like I was crazy and reminded me that I was married. He told me that there was nothing I could do to get him to stay there because he had a life waiting for him back in London. He also said he'd enjoyed the weeks that we had, but he wasn't looking to get involved in any drama between me and my husband. I felt embarrassed and childish for even suggesting it. He was leaving and I had to accept it. I just didn't expect how difficult it would be to let go of something I never really had a hold of in the first place. For all my talk of it being temporary, I had grown attached. I had built this little fantasy in my head, and it just continued to grow the longer I stayed in a bubble with Richie, but he was leaving. The bubble had burst. I couldn't say goodbye to him the morning that he left. Not properly, anyway. I told him to leave while I was asleep. I didn't want to say anything to him or have him say anything to me. It was easier for me to just leave and not deal with seeing him leave. I went back to the house that morning, and I immediately felt miserable. Without him, there was no distraction left. There was nothing but the dread of my reality. I was back to my marriage and my husband and the silence between us. I thought I had time to figure out how to navigate it. The guilt that eventually creeped in when I was finally alone. I thought I would have time to figure out what to do about my marriage. What the next step would be, especially after what I had done. But I didn't get that chance. It happened so simply, so stupidly honestly, all in that same day. My head was so all over the place. Lenny came back from work, and I wanted to avoid being around him for as long as I could, so I offered to make dinner. Then, like an idiot, I left my phone unlocked, just sitting on the coffee table while I worked in the kitchen, and then Lenny must have walked past it. I'll never know what exactly drew him in, whether he'd suspected all along, or if the text had popped up. He'd seen Richie's name, and just couldn't resist looking. Maybe it was just bad timing. I'll never know, but when he walked into the kitchen, his face told me everything. He tossed my phone on the counter so hard that a part of the screen cracked. The screen was lit with a goodbye message from Richie. Even after I'd told him not to send one or tell me anything, he still did. It was full of words about how grateful he was for our time together, and just how much he'd miss me. And worse, there was a photo of me attached. It was me asleep in his bed, naked and tangled in the sheets. A picture he'd probably taken as he was getting ready for his flight, and some stupid caption about not being able to resist capturing the moment. It was all there, and there was no escaping it. I was still wearing the bracelets I had on in the picture. There was no excuse or lie I could come up with. So I told him the truth of what happened. I filled in the blanks without giving too much detail. Lenny totally erupted after that. His anger filled the room, and he demanded more answers. He asked for timelines and if something was going on during the phone calls. But answering his questions didn't help. He just continued to shout accusations and insults. There was no controlling him. He went on about how he had known something was off, and that my friendship with Richie was never as innocent as I claimed it was. Now he had proof that I'd humiliated him, and then lied about it for weeks. I tried to explain and beg and to tell him it wasn't what it looked like, even though it was exactly that. But he wouldn't hear it. He told me that I had reduced him to nothing in front of his own family with those calls, and now I'd betrayed him by sleeping with another man. He told me that we had to get a divorce and that he would make sure I regretted it all, every moment of deceit and every time I had chosen Richie over him. And after that, he just left. He stormed out of the house without packing anything. He was just gone. I waited for him to come back for days. I waited for him to come around so we could talk, but he stayed gone. The silence was worse than the yelling had been. I didn't hear a word from him, and all my attempts to reach him failed. I thought maybe he would tell our families, and that obviously the dinner coming up, and all the others, would be canceled. But then my mother called and casually asked me what time I'd be around for dinner, as though nothing had changed. For a moment I let myself hope that he hadn't said anything, and maybe he hadn't decided yet, and there was still a possibility of forgiveness. I naively hoped that the dinner could be a chance for us to patch things up and to start again. I clung to that hope like a lifeline, and I went for the dinner. The house was warm and full of chatter, just like always. Everyone was hanging out and having fun. I tried to blend in, but Jay was solely focused on looking for Lenny. I eventually found him. He was sitting across the room, and I tried to catch his eyes, but he didn't look at me. Not once. When we all finally sat down at the table, side by side as we always had, he shifted away from me, enough to create space between us. And he ate in silence and spoke to everyone but me. I tried to engage, to talk to him, and to touch his arm, but he ignored me completely. Every single time, he pushed me away and totally disregarded what I said. It was as though I didn't exist. The realization hit harder than any insult he had thrown. The yelling, the accusations, and even the threats of divorce had carried heat. It had at least shown that I still mattered enough to stir that kind of passion in him. But suddenly, that was gone. I was nothing to him now. I was back to being invisible again, and he wanted everyone to see it. I knew then that this was his final act of humiliation. Not the storming out or the threats, but this. Making me sit through a dinner surrounded by family, and then treated as though I wasn't even there. It was the same way I'd treated him during all those calls, and it was humiliating. For weeks that went on, him making me feel like I didn't exist in front of all our family, while I had to pretend like everything was fine, just so no one would suspect anything, even though it felt like I was dying inside. But then the truth did come out. He told them all of it just like I knew he would. And as expected, it tore through more than just our marriage. The bond between our families completely broke, and the closeness we had all cherished was ruined, and I was the reason for all of it. My own family, who adored him and saw him as one of their own, were on his side. How could they now be? I was the one who had cheated and ruined our marriage. I knew his family would never look at me the same way again, or trust me or forgive me for destroying what we had built. My own family is keeping their distance while the divorce goes on, as some way of showing support to Lenny while I'm left all alone. I have no one now. I lost them. I lost it all.